Hi, I'm Joe, a Canadian citizen living in Central Europe. Recently, a friend forwarded me a Twitter post asking if Canada has a housing crisis, why don't they build houses within the red circle, with that red circle encompassing most of Canada's vast, uninhabited northern territories? After we discussed the reasons why this region remains undeveloped, he urged me to put all this information into a video, seeing as how this question continues to come up time after time, and evidently with both Canadian politicians and Canadian citizens alike almost completely unaware of these concepts. A video on the topic seemed like a worthwhile endeavor. Now, the short answer is the overwhelming majority of that territory is simply not suitable for any kind of urban or agricultural development as a result of that region's geology, which is dominated by a geological formation known as the Canadian Shield, in addition to the region's inhospitable climate and lack of transportation infrastructure. With that said, Canada's future development is so greatly hindered by its geology that I think it's worth looking deeper into just how little land Canada actually has to work with so that Canadians and the rest of the world can comprehend the true magnitude of the situation. In today's video, I'll begin by introducing the Canadian Shield and examining the current distribution of Canada's existing population in relation to the country's geology, followed by a brief look at previous development efforts within the Canadian Shield, and we'll conclude the video by looking at the current state of infrastructure and development within the region. Hopefully, by the end of this video, it will be clear just why Canada's Northern Territories cannot play a part in alleviating Canada's ongoing housing crisis. This video will be the first part in a two-part series examining development in Canada, so be sure to look out for part 2, where I'll discuss the current state of Canada's urban development and existing infrastructure, as well as possible future development within Canada, and how this connects to the housing crisis. Let's begin with a quick overview of the Canadian Shield. As you can see on this geological map of North America, roughly half of Canadian territory consists of the geological formation known as the Canadian Shield, shown here in red. The Canadian Shield consists of some of the oldest rock on planet Earth, being between roughly 2.5 to 4 billion years old, but there's nothing wrong with that. Rather, the problem with the region lies in the extensive transformation that occurred during the last ice age when glaciers covered most of the continent. This had two lasting effects. Firstly, the glaciers removed virtually all of the layers of soil and clay that had previously accumulated over the bedrock, leaving it exposed or at best covered in a thin layer of soil. Additionally, as the glaciers receded, this caused the underlying bedrock to rebound as the weight of the glaciers was removed, completely disrupting the drainage system of the region, leading to the formation of innumerable lakes and swamps that are readily visible in satellite photos. And that is how we get the current endless expanse of lakes, swamps, exposed rock, and thin soil that characterizes the region, none of which is conducive to the construction of new metropolitan areas with their characteristic basements, sewer lines, and subway tunnels, or for productive farming. Next, I'd like to examine the development of Canada relative to the Canadian Shield by looking at the geographical distribution of Canada's 100 largest cities, that is, those with a population of over 50,000 residents according to the 2021 census, and with those 100 cities accounting for 24 million inhabitants out of the total population of about 37 million. Turning to the map, we can immediately see how the geological constraints posed by the Canadian Shield have shaped the development of the country thus far, namely in that there are virtually no significant populated places on the entirety of the Canadian Shield. We can also see that the distribution of populated places across the country is concentrated in just 4 regions that both lie within Canada's borders and are not part of the Canadian Shield, those being a cluster of cities in the southwest corner of British Columbia, a handful of cities spread out across the prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and 2 large clusters of cities in Ontario and Quebec. We can also see that nearly all of these cities are located along the US border, 84 of which are within 100 kilometers of the US border, while 90 of Canada's 100 largest cities are within 200 kilometers of the United States border. Now let's take a closer look at each region. Starting from the west coast, we can see that most of British Columbia is in fact mountainous terrain, while the cluster that makes up the Greater Vancouver area is located on a small plain at the foot of the mountains. There isn't much territory to work with there, and everything that could be developed has already been developed. Moving to central Canada, we find the prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The prairies are part of the Great Plains that run north to south throughout the whole North American continent, but within Canada's borders, they are isolated from the rest of the country by 1,000 kilometers of the Rocky Mountains to the west and by nearly 2,000 kilometers of Canadian Shield to the east. The region spans roughly 550,000 square kilometers, and while the entire region has been adapted to agricultural use, the limited transportation infrastructure connecting it with the eastern and western regions of Canada, which I'll discuss later in the presentation, would make it difficult to sustain a large population, and so this region too is mostly unsuitable for any significant urban development. Zooming in, we can clearly see how virtually every inch of this region that is suitable for agricultural development has likewise already been developed. Moving on to Ontario, I've overlaid the geological map onto the satellite map, and we can see that there are virtually no cities currently located on the Canadian Shield, the areas shown in red and orange, and that the sprawling Toronto metropolis on the north shore of Lake Ontario and vast farmlands throughout the remainder of southern Ontario are located in the areas off the Shield, as represented by the blue and purple regions. Furthermore, zooming in on the Toronto region, we can clearly see a boundary between the purple and orange geological formations. And when we remove the overlay, we see that this boundary corresponds exactly with the halt in the northward development of Ontario's agricultural lands. We can also see that virtually all of southern Ontario has likewise already been developed into agricultural lands. Lastly, turning to the Montreal area, we see once again that the northern border of the limits of existing development correspond exactly with the changes in geological composition, while once again, whatever land in this region that is capable of being developed has already been developed. In conclusion, the only territory suitable for large-scale urban or agricultural development is what we see here, with the prairies in green and Toronto and Montreal in purple. However, this comes with the previously mentioned caveat that the prairies are not economically or logistically viable for large-scale urban development. So that leaves us with just the areas around Toronto and Montreal, which encompass roughly 120,000 square kilometers. For comparison, these two areas combined are only about one-third the area of Poland, which has roughly the same size population as Canada, of around 38 million, but occupies an area of 312,000 square kilometers. In each of the regions we looked at, we can see that by now, every inch of useful land has already been developed for agricultural or urban use. There simply do not exist vast swaths of useful lands that Canada just hasn't gotten around to developing yet. What's there is there, and there simply won't be any new land manifesting itself into existence. And it is here that I would like to point out that from now on, any ongoing urban development that occurs in Canada is accomplished solely by cannibalizing the existing farmland which supports those very urban centers. To me, this raises some significant questions regarding both sustainable development and national self-reliance, but I'll leave those to the listener to ponder. Next, I'd like to talk briefly about the challenges of developing the Canadian Shield as experienced during the construction of Canada's two transcontinental railway lines in the late 1800s. The construction of Canada's transcontinental railway remains an engineering feat that has been part of Canadians' shared heritage since the creation of the nation. However, most Canadians are only familiar with half the story. The difficulty in the construction of the transcontinental railway through 1,000 kilometers of the Rocky Mountains of British Columbia has been firmly ingrained in the psyche of most Canadians, due in large part to the short History Minute film by Historica Canada depicting the dangers of blasting through the mountains with nitroglycerin, even ending with the famous tagline,
They say there is one dead Chinese man for every mile of that track. That's what they say.
However, most Canadians are likely unfamiliar with the difficulties experienced during the construction of the two railway lines from Toronto to Winnipeg through 2,000 kilometers of the Canadian Shield, which marked the first major attempts at any kind of development of this region. The near insurmountable difficulties encountered during the completion of these two projects serve to show exactly what awaits anyone else thinking of developing this region. As previously mentioned, the region is characterized in part by exposed bedrock, which requires blasting to get through, as well as the endless expanses of lakes and swamps, which conceal a nasty secret, Muskeg. Many of you are likely familiar with the phenomenon of quicksand, but I'll bet that less of you have ever heard of Muskeg. Think of Muskeg as the swamp equivalent of quicksand, that is, a waterlogged layer of vegetation rather than sand, and it's found all throughout the Canadian Shield. The construction of the two transcontinental railways through the Canadian Shield in northern Ontario marked Canada's first encounter with Muskeg, which quickly became one of the most difficult sections to construct. Here, engineers, surveyors, and construction crews learned the hard way about the folly of building in Canada's north, as the Muskeg could swallow not only locomotives and equipment, but entire segments of track as well. The engineers then attempted to reinforce the track by dumping massive amounts of earth and gravel fill, only to discover that these Muskeg voids were virtual bottomless pits. Canada's Prime Minister at the time, Alexander Mackenzie, even declared that building across the Canadian Shield was one of the most foolish things that could be imagined. It's safe to say that the Canadian Shield does not remain undeveloped for lack of trying. So what was the result of these efforts? In the end, man triumphed over nature, and the lines were built. What we ended up with today are two single-track lines connecting Western Canada with Eastern Canada, one owned by Canadian Pacific, the other owned by Canadian National, both of which, as you've seen, twist and curve over, around, and through endless lakes, swamps, and rock cuts. It's been over a century since the transcontinental railways were constructed through the Canadian Shield, so next I'd like to look at the current state of that infrastructure. At present, there are still just the two single-track lines, one operated by Canadian Pacific, shown in maroon, the other by Canadian National, shown in green. Single-track railway lines have inherent limits to their capacity, as trains can only move in one direction at a given time, and the geology of the region will make it extremely difficult and costly, if not outright impossible, to build additional tracks to provide extra capacity, while the winding nature of those lines limits the speed at which trains can move. While both lines are currently used to transport freight, the CPR line lost most of its passenger service in the 1960s, while Via Rail took over passenger service over the CNR line, which exists in the form of train number 1, the Canadian, running from Toronto to Vancouver several times a week. Taking the train from Toronto to the next major Canadian city, Winnipeg, takes 34 and a half hours, covers 1,935 kilometers of track, all while traveling at a blistering average speed of just under 60 kilometers an hour. To better comprehend just how empty this region is, the population of the communities along the CN line between Parry Sound and Monackey, the last town before Winnipeg, which covers a distance of roughly 1,500 kilometers, adds up to just under 200,000, with most of that population being located in the city of Sudbury. Excluding Sudbury, the population is less than 20,000 people along 1,500 kilometers of track. For comparison with a European context, Warsaw to Paris by rail via Berlin is about an 1,800-kilometer journey, but only takes around 14 hours. And for the sake of thoroughness, here we can see the extent of major roads in the region as well. So, as we have seen, my answer to the original question of if Canada has a housing crisis, why don't they build within the red circle is the geology of the region is completely unsuitable for any kind of urban or agricultural development. This problem is compounded by the fact that previous attempts at developing the region were near miraculous feats of engineering and perseverance. This argument is supported by the simple fact that pretty much all development in Canada over the last century and a half has conspicuously occurred outside of this region, while all other areas in the country suitable for urban or agricultural development are already fully utilized for one purpose or the other. I hope you found this presentation informative, and please be sure to look out for part 2, where I take a closer look at the current state of Canada's urban development and existing infrastructure, as well as possible future development within Canada and how all this relates to the housing crisis. Thanks for watching.